Hi, and welcome back to our next lesson on the topic of balance. So when we think of the word balance in normal life, we think about, not teetering over and falling. And it's very similar with artwork. If an artwork is visually heavy on one side and very light in another area, that artwork looks like it's out of balance, like a seesaw that's been pulled down to one end, right? And similarly, when we are in balance in our lives, we feel very good and happy. And when an artwork is in balance, kind of equally heavy everywhere, the distribution of our eye landing on a particular part of the picture plane for a certain amount of time is fairly consistent across the entire picture plane, then we feel calm, right? We're not worried about anything. But if we are out of balance physically, if we're starting to fall, or if our life is out of balance in more of a symbolic way, then we don't feel at ease at all. And it's the same with artwork. So an artist can use this feeling of unease by creating a unbalanced composition if they want their viewer to feel a little bit out of whack looking at it. So maybe that would make sense if the topic were something that should make someone feel uncomfortable, for instance. But today we're going to talk about how to create balance. And the easiest way to create balance in a composition is by making it symmetrical. So that's not what we'll be doing for our homework because it's pretty easy and it's very clear. So here are 3 different kinds of symmetry that we could see in a 2-dimensional artwork. The first is inverted, and that is something that you see in the upper left in the Gardens of Versailles. In an inverted symmetry, 2 sides are the same. Okay, so this is the Garden of Versailles behind the Palace of Versailles, which is a town outside of Paris where King Louis XIV entertained his court. Below that, we have a Russian scarf, and you'll notice that it is symmetrical in 2 different directions, and so we call this biaxial symmetry. And to the right, we see another Russian scarf pattern, and that one all kind of radiates out from the center axis, and that is called radial symmetry. But most compositions are not perfectly symmetrical. So we would call these asymmetrical compositions, and these ones are a little bit more complicated to balance. So we're going to be spending this lecture today going through ways to balance an asymmetrical composition. But first, let's think about why we might want to have a symmetrical composition or an asymmetrical composition. So if there's only one subject and that subject is of utmost importance, nothing is competing with it for your attention, then you might as well put it in the middle, right? And that's often the case with portraits, like in this photorealistic painting portrait by Chuck Close on the left. Now, if there are multiple figures vying for our attention, in competition with each other for our attention in something like a narrative, then it makes more sense to use asymmetrical compositions because they allow more room for the action to take place. And they're also a little bit less boring. And the way that you arrange all the different figures within the narrative could tell us something about what the story is trying to explain. And so if we look at this one on the right, we don't actually think that Mary is in competition with the guy who's reading the book, or in competition with the people coming to adore the baby, or with those little baby angels with the chubby butts above. Those things are called putti in Italian Renaissance artwork. That's the name of those kinds of baby angels. And they're not actually literally in competition with each other, but they are in competition with each other for our visual attention. And so setting it up this way creates more of an interesting composition, and it also lets us know that there are multiple figures of importance here, not just one. So your homework today will be to create an asymmetrically balanced composition. So first we have to talk about how to create asymmetry, and then we have to talk about how to balance it. So starting with 1, we can use the rule of thirds. Now this is a quick way to make asymmetry in your artwork, and I'm going to actually draw on the slide here with the PowerPoint pen here. So with the rule of thirds, we think about dividing the picture plane into 3 columns and 3 rows. And there are dividing lines that separate these columns and rows. And in this chart that you see here, we see those in red, and where they intersect, we see little green dots. Now, you're not actually going to be drawing these out on your picture plane at all. You're just going to be envisioning the 3 equal rows and 3 equal columns, and where those dividing points would be. And what you want to do in the rule of thirds is put your important subjects and objects in the image near those intersecting points, but not on those intersecting points, and you wouldn't want to use all 4, because if you put them in all 4 of those spots and you put them right on the spots, you see we have symmetry again, don't we? But for instance, you might want to put one here, so it can touch, but they shouldn't necessarily all touch. So maybe you have one here, maybe you have one here near that point, but not quite on that point, and maybe you have one here, like near that point, but not on that point. And you don't do all 4, like I said, and now we have an asymmetrical composition. Imagine if all the lines were gone, we would have asymmetry. I mean, it's not the best composition yet, but we'll work on how to work beyond just using that to line things up. And so here are 2 examples of the exact same photograph, just cropped differently. On the left, the desert formation is not cropped with the rule of thirds. See how the important parts are not near those intersecting lines? And on the other one, it is cropped with the rule of thirds. And I think most of us would say that the one on the right is a more pleasing composition, right? The one on the left sort of looks like the desert is flicking us off. So how do we see the rule of thirds in this composition? It looks to me, and this is a painting of Judith slaying Holofernes. It's a story from the Old Testament. And Judith is a young woman, Holofernes is a guy whose head is being cut off. Okay, so we've clearly got some important, one of our important areas right here, don't we? And it's near one of those intersecting points. We have an important area here, his body, near one of those points. And we also have this kind of dramatic drapery up here, which is near one of those points as well. So here we have a triangular sort of setup with this composition too. And you'll note that if it weren't for the drapery, that whole upper area would be totally just dark, and it might feel a little bit too heavy on the bottom and the right. And so I noticed in a lot of old European Baroque and Renaissance artwork, if there's a compositional issue happening, people just throw a drapery in. This is what was used in that example that we used for continuation a few weeks ago, with the soldiers at the door and the naked people laying on the bed, and then there was just a big purple drapery that came across. Now that you hear me say this, when you go to a museum and see artwork from this period, you're going to notice all the drapes that were used to kind of fill in compositional, just used to fill in compositional needs. Okay, so once you have an asymmetrical composition, then how do you balance it, other than just putting a sheet, a sheet up in there? One way is to balance a less activated area with texture, color, or value. And so here we have the fighting Temeraire tugged to her last berth to be broken up by J.M.W. Turner. And this just seems at first perhaps like a pretty seascape, but there's actually sentimental story that goes along with this. So this was painted by a British artist, Turner, around the time that those old big sailing vessels, those galleons with the big sails, like the one that you see in the background there, are being replaced by kind of steam engine ships. And so here you see the fighting Temeraire, the big old ship, being tugged to be broken up, right, by the type of ship that's replacing it. And so it's very, it's kind of very sad and sentimental for the time, nostalgic for the time period when it was made. But let's talk about it in terms of its balance. It looks at first like it's probably awfully heavy where the two ships are, right? And so that would be the most visually heavy part of the composition, but the artist used a bunch of tricks in order to help balance out that heaviness there. So one thing that he did was that he put a lot of texture in the part of the sky that doesn't have a whole lot going on. And so you'll notice that it's not just a pure one color sky. Instead, you have a dark red, orange, yellow, darker yellow striping through it, kind of lots of back and forth contrast between darks and lights in that sky. You also have a lot of intense hues in that sky, don't you? Yes, very bright. And you also have a very light texture, a very light value in one of the yellows up there that sort of mimics some of the yellow that we see in the ship on the left. He also used value to balance the composition. You'll note that not only does this feel awfully heavy where the boats are, because that is the main narrative part of the image, but also because of the fact that it has a very light ship and a very dark ship next to each other. So you've got an intense amount of contrast there. And so it's a good thing that he's balanced that out with all that texture that we talked about and intense hues on the right. But you'll also note that there is one thing that's darker than the steam engine in the foreground of the two boats. And the only thing that's darker than that is that little tiny buoy in the bottom right. Okay? And so those two very dark things kind of connect visually, and that helps to pull our eye to the right side of the composition as well. But if he didn't have that little buoy that is backlit there, it would be still totally out of whack in terms of balance, even with all of the texture and intensity in the sky. So just hold your thumb up, cover up that buoy, and see how the artwork feels like it suddenly is so much heavier on the left side. See what I mean? So here's another example of someone who uses texture, color, and value to balance an artwork. And this is the artist Linda Schrank. She is an artist who starts with paintings, and of course she exhibits and sells her paintings, but then she scans them into the computer and manipulates them in Photoshop as well. I used to work for her as a studio assistant when I lived in New York, and so I helped her with this one actually. She's not that great at Photoshop, even though she knows exactly what she wants to do in it, so I used to go help her with that. But in this particular piece, it is clear that the left side has a big, heavy element, visually weighty, and it is, we know it because it's really dark, it's the largest shape, the largest collection of shapes. And we've got that really intense red that you don't see very much of elsewhere in the picture plane. Whereas the right, particularly the bottom right, feels a little bit less visually heavy, right? So she did balance this, particularly by putting a lot more texture on the right side. And so we see lots of shifts in contrast back and forth across the upper right particularly, but even in the lower right, we can see that there are these little dots of white paper showing through that you see in that little gray in the sort of background of that too. She also used a very intense green in the middle and right that we don't see that much in the very, very far left, and that helps to make the right compete for our attention with the left side as well. One of the things we said can help to activate a space that's less visually weighty would be texture. But if you think about it, text is texture, because texture we're thinking about big jumps in contrast, like lots of little marks making jumps in contrast. And so here we see that with writing as well, because we're seeing some dark against light or light against dark. And also because we have to look at text in order to read it. then our eye ends up lingering there longer than it necessarily would at any other part of the composition that we could just kind of intuitively see really quickly and understand what it is without actually reading it. Now, of course, one word doesn't take long to read, but particularly you can imagine if there's a sentence or so, then we'd have to stare at that part quite a bit longer than the other parts, and that helps to make it the heaviest texture. So text is the heaviest texture visually, particularly for people who are able to read in that language. Okay, so looking at this, we would say that the beach is the heaviest part. It has all those people that are backlit, and it has crashing waves and an umbrella, and so there's a lot going on down there, and very textured. And now the top part, the blue, doesn't look like as much is happening. So that word cool up there helps to pull the eye up. So does the more intense sky. You know, the sky is a lot brighter than a lot of the other things happening. And so together they help to balance out the composition. Here's another great example by the artist Uda Morrow. And in this one, the woman is by far the heaviest thing because she is a human being, and of course we care a lot about people. And she has a very elaborate outfit on that has many different patterns within it, so we'd say it has a lot of textures going on. She also has an eye gaze looking off to the right, and this helps to balance the composition, because if she was looking to the left instead of looking to the right side of the picture plane, this would not be balanced at all, because we follow eyes. When we see a person or an animal or anything with eyes looking in a certain direction, we look to see what they're looking at naturally. Even when we're on the street, if you see a couple of people looking up, you look up to see what the hell they're looking at, don't you? So it's the same with artwork too. And so not only is she looking into the empty space, the less activated space, and thus activating it for us, she is also looking at writing. And so if you can read this, then it will be a heavier part of the picture plane for you than for anyone who can't read it. But even people who can't read it see it as a texture, and that helps to activate that space as well. So remember, if you can read a language, that becomes more visually heavy for you than it would for somebody who can't, or vice versa. Now, back to the fighting temporary tug to her last birth to be broken up. To talk about continuation. We touched on the idea of continuation last week, last lesson. You know, we remember that it is the way that the eye moves around the picture plane. And if the artist sets up the picture plane in a way where kind of the eye moves back to where it started again and it starts the trend again instead of going off the picture plane, then that helps to keep the person looking at the artwork longer. But it also helps to activate the empty spaces because we're looking through them to get to the more visually heavy areas, and that helps to balance it. And so we can see that here. Of course, we've got the masks coming down. We've got the horizon line, so our eye goes across that. It connects the dark steam engine with the dark backlit buoy. So our eyes go down and across, but they wouldn't probably go back over to the ship if it weren't for all the directional texture in the sky. So we talked about the texture in the sky on the upper right being something that helps to makes that area a little bit more heavy, but it also has this kind of diagonal line that goes through it, and that helps to pull our eye back over to the masts. And so I think it's pretty clear what I'm talking about, but I'm going to draw it anyway. So do you see how there's a kind of a line that goes up along here? That helps to pull the eye back over to the mast, down, across, and so we start to get this set up again. Okay, so what about this one? This one is obviously very heavy on the bottom, and more heavy on the bottom than the top, so it's not balanced in that way. But in terms of left to right balance, it is actually balanced, even though it seems like it should be heavier on the right. And so on the right, we have a young boy and an old man in a boat looking at us. And because they're looking at us, we're going to be looking at them. It feels like a little bit of a confrontation. Not a particularly hostile one, though, because look how happy the little boy is to see us. The old man looks kind of grumpy, but I don't think we're in any kind of danger here. But they're looking at us, so we're looking at them. They also have a mangrove behind them, and it is a little bit to the right. The boat is a little bit to the right. Now, a couple of things that have balanced this are, of course, that the darkest thing in here is the cat, and the cat is on the left side of the composition. But even more so, we know that the boat is a little bit to the right, but we can also see that he is rowing in a certain direction, and he is rowing towards the left. And so there's this little bit of tension that they're not balanced yet, but they're going to be balanced any second. So for us, it already feels like it's balanced because our mind is continuing the motion that they're in. They're obviously in, okay? And so if there is a clear, obvious direction that is happening within the work, then we're going to feel like the work, everything is a little bit to the direction that it's going. Here's an example that I think relates to that last example. So this is by Peter Doig, and he certainly would have known that piece. And we have a very similar thing happening here. We don't have a mangrove exactly in the background. We have an island. We have a person in a boat staring at us, and a canoe again. Now, this one, everything is a little bit to the left. The island's to the left. The man in the boat is to the left, but the boat itself is perfectly centered. There's the same amount of space on the right side as the left side. But because he is going towards the left, it's going to become even less balanced in a moment. So it feels very tense. And I think it makes sense that it feels very tense, that he set it up to make it feel imbalanced, because the man is staring at us in a much more confrontational looking way than in the last one. And it looks like he's got some kind of skull and crossbones t-shirt on or tank top on. And so I think it's meant to be a little bit confrontational in a way that the last one wasn't. And I think it's out of balance in order to further that emotion in the viewer. Okay, so let's look at this example by Kerry James Marshall. Now, he has used a lot of the tricks to balance this piece. And so I would argue that this piece is visually heaviest in the bottom because of the contrast between the darkness of the figure's skin and the lightness of their white clothing, and between the kind of achromatic blacks and whites down there with the really intense red. You know, the red has a lot of saturation in it in the picnic basket. And of course, that also is just the texture of the pattern of the picnic basket too. So there's a lot going on down there, plus the fact that those three figures are all looking at us, making eye contact, which makes us want to make eye contact with them. And so the bottom is super, super heavy. So what are some of the ways that he helped to balance out the rest of the composition so that the bottom wouldn't be quite as heavy? So one of them is that the red of the picnic basket is seen a little bit in a more muted way, but still seen it above in the apartment buildings or city buildings in the background. At the very, very top, you can see some buildings, and they have a more muted version of the red that we see below. So that helps to reference that and pull our eye back and forth, like we talked about earlier. He also has text in this above. It says, something of heart, all something skill will also work, something heart and will. Okay, so not only did it take me a while to read the words in there because the banner goes behind the tree and the banner has birds in front of it and the banner curves back, but also the words get smaller as it goes back into space, you know, towards the left side. And so he's not only used text, which takes us a while to read, but he's made it really, really hard to read. And so we spend up a lot of time trying to decipher what is happening in the top. And so he's used that trick very well. He also has a continuation set up within this. And so I'm going to draw on it again. I don't see a lot of yellow in there, so I will use yellow. No, actually, I'll use purple. I do see some yellow in there. Okay, so our eyes certainly start with these three figures, but then there's a shape that goes straight up on the side. We've got the banner that pulls across, and we've got the golfer. So we're back down to the bottom again. And so we've got this kind of oval setup where our eye keeps going around and around in circles. And sometimes we'll look at the boat, but the boat takes our eye right back up to this banner again, which brings us down to the golfer. And so the eye really stays within the picture plane. Another thing that he uses in this work to balance out, to make the top more activated, to balance out the heavy bottom, would be the fact that there is a very little blue in the bottom. There's one croquet ball. See the little girls playing croquet in the bottom left? That is kind of a fairly saturated kind of pastel blue. Pastels are not saturated, but that one is kind of in between being saturated and not being saturated, I guess. That kind of robin egg blue also appears in the birds above and in the big lake with the water skier and the guy in the boat. And so because there's only the tiniest bit of it below and there's lots and lots of that blue above, that blue kind of being more isolated in that one area and not below helps to make that area stand out in a way, just by making it so different than what's below. So I think that he used a great many tricks to balance out this asymmetrical composition. And here is a Manet. Let's see how he went about doing this. So I just want you to pause me and spend a few minutes thinking about the ways that he balanced this out. Okay, we're back. So I think it's clear that the figure is the heaviest part, and the figure is mainly on the right and the bottom. And the wallpaper in the upper left is fairly not heavy, but it is activated in a number of ways. And one is that he is leaning towards it, and so his whole body sort of points towards that side that doesn't have as much going on. Also, the smoke from his cigar is rising up into it, right? And his cigar has this really nice blue that contrasts with the sort of brownish yellow of the wallpaper behind and cuts through, and so it's fairly noticeable. Not only is he leaning towards that area, but he's also kind of gazing, like he looks a little spaced out, but he's sort of gazing generally towards the left. He's not looking at the wallpaper behind him, but he is looking at the book, or maybe a little bit above and past the book, and so it's still helping to activate the left side to a larger degree. And he also has sort of marks on the wallpaper, a design, some kind of design in the wallpaper that helps to make it stand out a little bit more. Also, we note that there is a shadow on the left side that doesn't exist within the other parts of the wall. Of course, his head is casting a shadow right behind him, but otherwise the wall is pretty evenly lit, except for on the far left, where you see a shadow creeping across the edge of that wall, which helps to activate it a little bit too by just making it different than the rest of the wall. Okay, so we discussed balance today. We talked about how symmetry is obviously balanced but kind of easy in terms of composition, inverted, biaxial, and radial. And then we talked about all kinds of ways to achieve asymmetrical balance. And that's what you will be doing for your homework. So that's the entire assignment. There's not a lot of direction in this one because I want you to start to go off and make all of your own formal decisions, okay? So you're going to achieve asymmetrical balance, any method, any media. So let's talk about what would and would not qualify for this assignment, just looking at some of the artwork that I have around my house. And so this is one of my own paintings, and so actually a little bit three-dimensional, but you're seeing it from the front here, so it's hard to tell. And in this one, it's not perfectly symmetrical, but the main thing is basically right in the middle, right? That succulent is pretty much right in the middle of everything. And so this is not asymmetrical enough for what I'm looking for. This is mostly in the center too. We could say that it's a little bit heavier on the top and the left because the figure is, his head and his arms are on the top and the left, but overall he's mostly put right in the middle. And so this one is still not that asymmetrical. I mean, it's asymmetrical, but not asymmetrical enough for what I'm looking for. Okay, even this one, these are both paintings of mine as well. Even this one is not going to work because even though there is a space, I would say the very far right bottom part is a little bit less activated than the rest, but for the most part, there's just stuff everywhere. You know, the marijuana leaves are a little bit to the right on the top, and they're a little bit to the left on the bottom. But if you were to kind of go diagonally across, they'd pretty much be the same both ways diagonally. And so, not going to work. This is one of my early pieces that incorporated patterns from around 2012 or 2013, and its composition would be applicable to this assignment because there are heavier areas and less heavy areas, and they are not symmetrical. So I would say that the heaviest area of this, visually the weightiest area, would be the pattern with the white background, the pattern that has a bit of light blue in it. And then the secondary kind of heavy areas would be the bottom right, where that really dark blue is, and the top where the dark blue is. And so the rest of it, where it's kind of similar in hue, the yellow and orange is a little bit less activated, right? And so, I'm sorry, it's a little bit less heavy, right? But it is activated because our eye kind of links those two blues and pulls our eye back and forth across. Also because the yellow is shown in a kind of a curve that cuts through it, but very much because the right below and a little bit to the above and to the right of the white pattern, you see that that yellow pattern cuts through the orange pattern around it in rays, and so it's pointing through to all these less heavy areas and thus kind of activating them visually. Now here's another one of my pieces that would count. I think that it's definitely asymmetrical. I think that the big, like silvery looking shapes, the big gray shapes are the ones that are probably the heaviest here because they're so big and right kind of imposing in the closer to the middle of the composition. And so a couple of things were done here. First of all, we connect all the blues and they make sort of a circle when we do connect them, and we connect all of the gray areas and they sort of make a triangle when we do connect them. That brings us through the rest of the picture plane. But I'd say one of the least activated parts, or the least heavy parts, would be on the right, this golden area, the part that looks gold, the brown and yellow from here to here and across to the gray. That area is pretty kind of empty looking, but it is activated because the blue shape above it has drip marks that are pointing down to the other blue below. And so it's kind of pointing through the space that is not very activated and thus activating it to get to the next area. So this would count compositionally. This is a photograph that I have by the photographer Doug Barber, photographer out of Maryland. And this one works, obviously it's heavy where the biker is. There's a lot of action going on there, but it works really well because he is not only moving towards the left, and so we're already feeling like that is about to become, it's satisfying to know that it's about to become balanced as soon as he goes a little bit further to the left. But he's also looking towards the left, and so we talked about how we follow eye direction. Also, he has those little birds up there too that help to activate that side a little bit. Okay, and now on to the demo.
All right, I'm going to be demonstrating how to create an asymmetrical composition that is balanced. So these little dotted lines represent this concept of the rule of thirds that we talked about in the lecture. You don't actually have to draw these out, but I'm doing this with tracing paper just to give you a sense. So we said in order to create asymmetry, an easy way to do that is to place objects near, but not exactly on, these intersecting points, and not to use all four. So maybe just use 3. So let's say, for example, I decided I wanted my main objects to be a little bit to the below and to the left of this intersection point, a little to the left of this one, and a little above and to the left of that one. Okay, so that does that is going to set up a sense of asymmetry. So what I might do, and this would be an example of where I'd be making things kind of hard on myself, is choose circles. I know students tend to gravitate towards circles. So let's say I decided to make just circles for this piece. The reason that I find that to be a little bit more difficult is that circles are really self-contained. They don't point in any direction. We talked about how things that curve can help make the eye go around. And so you might be making things harder on yourself if you just choose circles in a non-representational project. But you could do that. So what are some possible things you could do to make the circles work? Well, you could certainly use some of the examples that we talked about, some of the techniques that we talked about in the lecture earlier. So one thing we said is that if you have a composition that is heavy in the bottom and heavy on the left, you need to activate the upper right. And we talked about how you could do something like having a dark gradient come away in this section and then get lighter as you go towards this section. We talked about how you could have something really red and dark here and then have it mirrored elsewhere in the composition. So I have these drop shadows that are the same kind of red shown here and here. I also have a lot of texture in this gradient, and the texture is moving in this direction, so it sets up a sort of a circular composition, and also it's over here a little bit too, which kind of pulls it back around. And so suddenly you do have a fairly balanced, albeit really boring artwork. You know, this is what, you know, this is just kind of, this is a little dull, I think, but it is technically a pretty balanced composition. Now, let's look at what else you could do with the circles. So here we have these circles using eye direction to activate that space. So I don't think that that alone could possibly, would exactly fulfill the idea of balancing that, but we might be able to do something to add to this a little bit. It's kind of a funny piece we have going on here. And I might want to do something like have a really dark gradient that becomes light when it gets to this side. So let's say it starts off white here, ends up black here, and so it's going to get darker and darker and darker and darker and darker and darker as you move across the picture plane towards the direction where they're looking, and that could suggest maybe that they're looking into some kind of void or into a cave, and then it'll set up sort of a little story and a narrative, and that could help to that could help as well, because you have this really dark part here and they'd just be sort of in the mid-tone and in the light section, and since they are white, there wouldn't be a whole lot of contrast here, and this part would kind of feel a little bit heavier, right? And it would be kind of funny. But I think it's a lot easier if you do not use circles, so let's try something else. You can make any kinds of shapes that you want. So here I have a composition started that has very different shapes. And even before I do anything like adding the textures or eye direction or anything like that, I already have a pretty good composition because, because we have this sort of pointing situation happening here. So even though this space is not very activated, it's being pointed through, isn't it? Right? And this piece curves along this way, this piece curves, and note that your shapes do not actually have to stay on the picture plane, right? I decided to make that piece really big, and big to the point that it went off of the picture plane, right? We develop an open composition, okay? And so certainly I can do extra things like add gradients and any of those other things we talked about in terms of creating movement across the composition, but the fact that it's already in this in these shapes helps to set that up already. But let's say you wanted to do something sort of like this, but you wanted to do photography, or you wanted to do a painting of representational things. Well, that's totally fine too. So I created a composition that is very similar to the one below, but actually involves people, okay? And so we could do a little sketch here to decide how we want to set up our photograph, for example. And you can see that we've got somebody in the foreground sitting on a rock reading a book. That's what it's supposed to be anyway. And we've got a figure in the background, jumping, maybe doing jumping jacks. I originally was thinking they might be trying to pick something off the tree, but actually the tree goes down so much further that they're far away. I'm noticing now. But you do get the sense of how this is a tree, and this is a little guy in the background, this is a little person in the foreground, and even though they are representational, they are in a very similar composition to this below. And so we still have a lot of the same elements happening here. This person is leaning their head forward because they're reading and looking down that way, which makes the head kind of point up, and this tree limb is coming down. And the trunk comes down this way and meets up with this guy, and so we still have this whole sense of continuation in here. And maybe this isn't enough, you know, maybe you still feel, and this is the horizon line, is what I'm thinking. Maybe you still feel that this part isn't activated enough just because there's this connection in this shape. But that's okay, there's still more you could do. You could take a photograph when the sky up here has lots of clouds in it, for example, because that would be a sense of texture. Or maybe the sky is really intensely blue up here, but as it gets down towards the horizon, it becomes a little hazier, a little like whiter, and you know, not as exciting. And so you could think about ways to use these compositional tricks in photography or in representational painting. And you can sort of set this up if you know where the scene is that you want to shoot. You could always take a photograph of that general scene and then think about how you want to arrange things in it and how you want to crop it differently to make it work with this roll of thirds. You could take a bunch of shots, pull them back, and see if they possibly work. You know, being near these, having 3 sections near these intersections. I hope that that was helpful. If you have any questions, please comment on the updates page of our Celtic Online class page. Thanks.